Good afternoon, everyone. This is the March 1st meeting of the City Finance Committee. And may I have a roll call, please?
Yes, we'll start with Committee Member Harmon.
Here.
Committee Member Gutierrez. Committee Chair Friedman.
Here. And I know that Committee Member Gutierrez is trying to log in, but there's a link problem, but we're going to start since we have a very tight agenda today. So before we get on with our agenda, I just want to emphasize or change up the order and how today's meeting is going to go. So we are going to switch the items today. So we will be hearing the second quarter financial review first, so that we have the remainder of the time to deal with the ARPA update and recommendations. And then as part of that, public comment for any items will be at 2 minutes. And then when we get to the ARPA, I'll explain how we're going to go through the process at that point. So for now, I will ask if there are any members of the public who wish to speak to any items not on today's agenda under the purview of the Finance Committee. And Mr. DiMartini, do you see anybody wishing to speak to any items not on the agenda?
Chair Friedman, before I continue with that, Committee Member Gutierrez has arrived, so she is here. All three members are present.
Great, perfect.
And yes, I couldn't speak when you called my name out. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you so much, Committee Member Gutierrez. I am monitoring public comment. I do see one hand raised. Daryl Sheck, I am allowing you to speak. Please proceed.
Good afternoon, members of the Finance Committee. A little disappointed about the 2 minutes versus 3 minutes since I prepared for 3, but my name is Daryl Sheck, Executive Director of SEIU Local 620, representing hundreds of your valued employees here at the City of Santa Barbara. And we appreciate the Finance Committee and the city have their priorities. And today I'm asking you to renew the focus on prioritizing a stable, local, established, and knowledgeable workforce here at the city. And that includes wages and healthcare benefits that retain your valued staff. Our members came through in the clutch. The system here at the city did not break during COVID-19 directly because of the efforts of city employees, and they are indeed heroes through this horrible time in human history. All we're asking is that this recognition is paid forward. Our members face outrageous challenges moving ahead, and we desperately need your help. Other jurisdictions have stepped up and at least temporarily recognized their employees in meaningful ways. Our members are grateful for increases in compensation and one-time money that helps keep them afloat, but we also have to look at this problem pragmatically and for the long term with meaningful adjustments. Housing costs have exploded, not just in Santa Barbara, but surrounding environs. The mantra that one can commute from Lompoc and save money no longer holds true. Rents in Lompoc and other surrounding communities of Santa Barbara are spiraling out of control and approaching Santa Barbara rents. A typical employee that makes $60,000 per year pre-tax now has a $30,000 income towards their income going towards housing after taxes, assuming a $2,500 per month rent, which is now considered on the low side. Assuming they also have to pay 22% taxes on that pre-tax salary, there's very little left over for food, transportation, clothing, essentials, much less caring for a child or a dependent. And I know as council people, you know this because your own salaries are probably not keeping up. The situation's absolutely unsustainable. Rank and file employees, we need your help, and hiring more middle management to parse out things further it's not going to solve the problem. We need well-paid shoes and boots on the ground that work, live, and take part in the city. More and more of the workforce is looking like a band of economic refugees fighting for inexpensive places with cramped conditions or unacceptable commutes. And our members and your employees need your help in housing and in wages. The extra whammy of inflation is crushing our members. There are very few haves in this city with a vast majority of have-nots that service the needs of the haves. And this problem is just exacerbated each year. And we know it didn't happen overnight, but we need your leadership to help city management recognize the value that a dedicated group of local devoted city employees provides. We know it's not easy for you either. And we thank you for listening. And we know that your job's not easy in balancing all the priorities that are out there. And I just want to say thank you very much. It's really tough right now. I mean, I'm just looking at those housing prices and it's just killing everybody. It's just probably the number one priority we got to deal with in this city is just getting some kind of workforce housing because it's just such a disparate, separation between the haves and the have-nots. And I just want to say thank you very much for your time. We appreciate all that you do. And looking forward to working with you going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Sheck. Any other members of the public wish to speak to items not on today's agenda?
Chair Friedman, I am monitoring public comment. There are no other hands raised at this time.
Okay, so I'll close public comment and we will move on to the agenda item, which is number 2, because we're moving up the quarterly report. So we'll go there for the fiscal year 2022. Mr. DeMartini, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair Freeman. Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Keith Martini. I'm the city's finance director, along with Ms. Natalia Glutik from the accounting division. We're here to present an overview of the second quarter financial review. And we'll go through this rather quickly, knowing that we have a large item after this one. Next slide, please. The objective of this presentation is to provide the committee with a status of revenues and expenditures received to date through the first 6 months of the fiscal year, accept the fiscal year 2022 interim financial statements through December 31st of 2021, and then recommend that council approve the proposed second quarter adjustments for fiscal year 2022 appropriations and estimated revenues as detailed in the attachment to the agenda report. Next slide, please. The agenda for this presentation is for staff to provide you an overview of the general fund update, the enterprise funds as well, go through very briefly the proposed budget adjustments, and then take any questions, public comment, and discussion that committee would like to have. Next slide, please. Staff brings frequent updates to the Finance Committee and the City Council about sort of updates on our budget and financial major topics, revenues and expenditures, and capital projects, and all the things that impact the city's budget. We come to the committee once a quarter at the conclusion of the quarterly reports. This presentation to you today is through quarter 2. We will come to you again at the end of quarter 3 and the end of quarter 4 as well. And then also we will bring the full financial statements to you at the conclusion of the fiscal year of our annual comprehensive financial report, which will come in December of 2022. Next slide, please. This slide provides an overview, a pie chart of the general fund revenues, the left pie chart, and the general fund expenditures, the right pie chart, for the revised budget for fiscal year 22. The left pie chart, you can see that we do have a diverse revenue stream coming into the general fund. Our largest revenue source comes from property taxes, our largest single revenue source. We do receive a great deal of sales and use tax, including Measure C, as well as transient occupancy tax, utility users tax, departmental revenues. Many other taxes fall into that other revenue category at 27%. On the right side, you can see that a majority of the city's general fund tax dollars are spent on the public safety function, that of police and fire. You can also see that community services, which includes the library and parks and recreation, receive a next largest chunk, as well as other functions from community development, public works, and other functions as well. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to give you a brief overview of where we stand financially in the general fund through the first 6 months of the fiscal year, as well as providing you a high-level projection of where staff anticipates the general fund ending at the end of the fiscal year as well. The revised budget includes revenues in the general fund of just under $170 million, with expenditures of just over $176 million. So you can see we have a deficit there in the revised budget. It's important to note that the revised budget does include carryover of prior year commitments. So where we have contracts that might span multiple fiscal years, we carry over a small amount of appropriation from the prior year into the current fiscal year, where that appropriation will remain so that we can pay those prior year commitments. You can see the adopted budget, the first column on the left, shows the $1 million deficit that we have widely communicated. You can see our actuals through Q2 and the current fiscal year projection, which shows us resulting in a projected surplus of $6.5 million. That surplus comes about from a number of key reasons. First and foremost, on the revenue side, sales tax and transient occupancy tax is projected to come in a little bit stronger than was originally anticipated, with the rebound from COVID, with a lot of the economic activity that has stalled or has not been very strong since COVID, and it has fluctuated quite significantly. It has rebounded a little bit more strongly than the original projections portrayed. On the expenditure side, you may recall that the adopted budget called for just over $6 million of expenditure reductions in order to help balance the $8 million deficit that was projected in the general fund. Staff is achieving those reduction targets primarily by holding positions vacant, which we have done now for going on the better part of 2 or up to 3 years. Above and beyond the expenditure savings from holding those positions vacant, we are projecting additional savings because there are a number of vacant positions that we are having quite a hard time filling. It's a very challenging environment to backfill positions. So we anticipate additional salary and fringe benefit savings from those positions. It's important to note that council policy, council resolution requires that 50% of a year-end general surplus be transferred directly to the general fund capital outlay fund to be used for capital purposes. And so half of that $6.5 million projected surplus will be transferred there at the conclusion of the fiscal year reporting period. Effectively, what's important to note here is that, again, when considering the fact that we had an $8 million deficit in the adopted budget in fiscal year 22 in the general fund, we are achieving a balanced budget by reducing expenditures of about $6.8 million, primarily by holding positions vacant, and dipping into our reserves by about $1 million. Effectively, the deficit is around $1 million now, with the projection of a surplus of around $6.5 million. And then when looking into next fiscal year and beyond, as we will start doing with the Finance Committee and the City Council in the coming weeks, we are projecting deficits in fiscal year 2023 through 2025. Next slide, please. On the revenue side, property tax continues to be strong. We're expecting continued growth, but not at the same rapid level that we've been experiencing over the past couple of years. Sales tax and transient occupancy tax, we're projecting to be strong, as I mentioned earlier, and continue to grow into what the pre-COVID levels had been. Next slide, please. We'll skip this slide for the sake of time. Next slide, please. Just to reiterate here that the fiscal year 22 adopted budget assumed $6.8 million of expenditure reductions, which I mentioned. That deficit came about because of the decline of revenue that was being projected, and holding positions vacant and achieving other operational savings was required to help us balance that budget, and using $1 million of reserves. Next slide, please. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Natalia, who will present expenditures and overview of enterprise funds as well.
Thanks, Keith. So as mentioned before, we're just a hair under 50% under the annual budget, which is right where you think we should be at 50% through the year. The budgeted numbers that you see here in column 2, or the second column rather, include each department's portion of that $6.8 million in reductions, as well as the budgeted adjustments approved throughout the course of the fiscal year. A couple of notable items, vacancies in the city administrator's office, namely the senior assistant to the city administrator and the administrator's specialist, have resulted in savings in the city administrator's office of only spending 38% of their budget thus far this year, and looking at about $300,000 in savings by fiscal year end. Fire has met its reduction target for the year, despite a large hit to overtime due to increased fire activity, including that Dixie fire, which is why they're tracking slightly ahead of budget at 53% instead of 50%. But on the other side of the fence, the increased fire activity also resulted in higher mutual aid receipts, netting additional revenue for the department. Sustainability and Resiliency's budget is mostly for personnel, particularly the director position, which is currently vacant, resulting in their spending only 11% of their annual budget. All of the departments have already or expect to meet their expenditure reduction targets for FY22. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Keith to talk to you about the reserves projections.
Thank you so much, Ms. Glusick. So this slide summarizes our reserve trends in the general fund over the past couple of years and where we project to be at the end of this fiscal year. Starting at the top, we have a contingency reserve target of 10% and then a disaster reserve target of 15%. So we should have at a target level a total of approximately $37 million in the general fund to meet those reserve targets. You can see that we have not met those targets. We have been below those targets over the past couple of years. And with this most recent projection, we are basically projecting to be on target. But it's important to note here that we are underfunded in other areas, primarily our self-insurance fund. We are also underfunded with our pension unfunded actuarial liability. This chart here does summarize what portion of the underfunding of our self-insurance fund the general fund is responsible for. Effectively, the general fund is responsible for approximately $6 million of the underfunding of the self-insurance fund. And the Finance Committee has given staff the direction that we are to make progress in getting the self-insurance fund back to a stable position over the next 9 years, which we will be building in additional allocations from the general fund and all the other funds in the proposed budget going forward. But it's important to note that the general fund is on the hook for a significant portion of the underfunding of the self-insurance fund. Next slide, please. This slide is a graphical representation of the past 17 years of our general fund reserve position actuals compared to the target. The target is the line and the bar graphs are our actual reserves. You can see here in fiscal year 22, we're about at target given the most current projection, but you can see that we have fluctuated and have been below our reserve target ever since the financial recession occurred back in 2008, 2009. It took us many years to recoup from that. And then when COVID hit in fiscal year 2020, we dipped into our reserves significantly. It's also important to note that in fiscal year 21, at one point, we had fully depleted our contingency reserves and we were already dipping into our disaster reserves. There was a point at which that was occurring. We have since rebounded and are in a better position. Although looking at our base projection for fiscal year 23, you can see here on the far right bar graph, we are already far below the reserve target as well because of the deficits that we are projecting in fiscal year 23. Next slide, please. So considerations for the current fiscal year and beyond. We had a structural deficit of $8 million in the general fund this year. We solved that by achieving expenditure reductions and using a minimal amount of reserves. There are pressures on the general fund going forward, including labor MOU negotiations, increases to our pension costs. I mentioned before our self-insurance fund and the low reserves that we have in our self-insurance fund. The second item before you today is the direction that council would like to take with the American Rescue Plan Act, the ARPA funds. That could potentially impact reserves as well. And as I mentioned, deficits are being projected for the next 3 fiscal years. So we do have challenges in the general fund into the foreseeable future. I'll turn it back over to Ms. Glusick, who will give an overview of the city's enterprises.
Thank you. Next slide, please. I'd like to provide a brief overview of the city's enterprise funds. The staff report accompanying this presentation discusses each fund in more detail. Enterprise uses revenues generated directly from the operations to pay for their operating capitals and expenditures without any general taxation reports. So unlike the general fund slides, these tables show revenue and expenditures performance on the same chart. There's been cost savings across the board due to a combination of unfilled vacancies and other operating savings. Excuse me. The solid waste, water, and wastewater funds are all performing pretty much in line with budget expectations and common mid-year trends at Q2. Downtown parking shows some encouraging signs of COVID recovery as the restrictions lessen, but they're still having a lower demand for monthly permits as people continue to work from home, and the hourly demand on work days is still fairly low. Meanwhile, the expenditures are back to tracking at pre-pandemic levels. Next slide, please. The Santa Barbara Clean Energy Fund received its first rate revenue in Q2 with service beginning in October. As this is a new fund, there was very little expenditure and no revenue in the prior year, which resulted in drastic increases to both in the current year. With better than expected participation from the ratepayers, staff expects to, excuse me, staff expects their performance to meet or exceed their budget. Airport has rebounded nicely with the opening of restrictions and an increased desire to travel. In addition, SBA has been awarded $19.3 million in grant funding, including that ARPA grant, which will support revenue shortfalls, and staff also expects the budget to meet fiscal year as it progresses. Golf is remaining stable as an outdoor activity that facilitates social distancing, and like downtown parking, Waterfront felt the effects of COVID-19, but they're showing a much stronger recovery due to early repayment of leases on rent deferrals and increased parking and also commercial and restaurant revenues. Next slide, please. So as far as the enterprise funds are sitting, we noted that the downtown parking was particularly hard hit by COVID with that decreased demand for monthly parking permits as people continue to work from home and less demand for hourly permits on work days. So they're not doing quite as well as the rest of the city, but they still are recovering. And clean energy, being a new fund, is only starting to receive revenues in Q2 and is still recovering from its startup costs. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Mr. DeMartini.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lusick. So just a high-level overview of the proposed budget adjustments. There are no significant budget adjustments being proposed at this time, but there are some minor ones. And they're summarized here on this slide, but the full detail of all the budget adjustments are listed in attachment 3 to the agenda report. It does include a modest use of general fund reserves to continue with security services at City Hall, some fire department mutual aid revenue, a Friends of the Library grant, a grant for the Parma Park, airport Fairview Hangar project transfers to move forward with that project. There are some transfers in the waterfront department for some capital projects. And then there's additional claim payment activity that requires additional appropriation in the self-insurance fund. And again, those budget transfers are itemized in detail in attachment 3 to your report. Next slide, please. So with that, staff respectfully request that the Finance Committee recommends to the City Council to accept the fiscal year 2022 interim financial statements for the first 6 months of the fiscal year, and recommend that the council approves the proposed second quarter adjustments for fiscal year 2022 appropriations and estimated revenues as detailed in the attached schedule to the agenda report. With that, we'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. DeMartini and staff. So at this point, I will open up to questions from the committee. Are there any questions from my colleagues? Hearing none, I will open it up to public comment. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak to this item? Please raise your hand in the app. I don't see any. Do you see any, Mr. DeMartini?
Chair Friedman, I am monitoring public comment. I see no hands raised at this time.
I will close public comment, and at this point, I open up to comments, and we will need a motion. So to my colleagues, Councilmember Gutierrez.
No questions at this time or comments.
Would you like to make the motion
Oh, yes, I would like to make a motion
for the staff recommendation?
for the staff recommendation. Thank you.
Perfect. The motion's been made. Councilmember Harmon, comments?
No comments, just appreciate all the work that's gone into this and keeping us updated, and I will second that motion.
Thank you. Thank you for the update to staff. There are a lot of challenges here, but there's a lot of moving pieces as well, as next item will show. So with that, can we have a roll call, please?
Yes, the motion was made by Committee Member Gutierrez, seconded by Committee Member Harmon. We'll do a roll call vote. Committee Member Gutierrez,
Yes,
Committee Member Harmon,
Yes.
Committee Chair Friedman.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much.
Great. So now we are moving on to item number 1, the first item on our agenda, the American Rescue Plan Act update and appropriation request. And before we start, I just want to give some clarification for the public on how this is going to proceed so that we will have, hopefully be able to make it through this. So we will hear the staff presentation. Then we will open up to comments from the committee members. Then we'll have public comment. And depending on where we're at, it's likely going to be 2 minutes. And then we will come back to my colleagues and I, and we can make comments, but what we'll do is have you go through the items that you support for funding. And don't worry about the total at first. We just want to see what is supported. And Mr. DeMartini will be keeping a list, and any items that get two of us to support will go forward. And then once we have an idea of what those are, we will work with the cost to get it to fall within 10.9 million. So the goal is to take one final vote at the end on an entire package to forward to council, rather than a series of votes on each individual item. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. DeMartini for the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Chair Friedman, members of the committee, thank you very much. The agenda for today's presentation is to provide a brief overview of the American Rescue Plan Act. It's more commonly known as ARPA. We'll talk about the state and local fiscal recovery funds. That's the program within the ARPA legislation that is providing relief to cities just like the city of Santa Barbara. We'll provide staff's recommendations for the second tranche of ARPA funds. We'll make our request to the Finance Committee and then take questions, open up to public comment, and take committee's discussion. Next slide, please. So brief overview of the ARPA legislation. It was signed into law by the president back in March 11th of 2021. It followed the CARES Act, which was signed the year prior, which again provided a significant amount of financial resources directly to cities like ours that were incurring additional cost directly related to COVID. The ARPA legislation was around $1.9 trillion. It included stimulus and recovery funds, provided response for continuing impacts from municipalities related to COVID. And there was a $350 billion program within ARPA that allocated money directly to cities like us for federal recovery funds for many areas of the economy. Next slide, please. So of that, the portion that affects the city directly is this state and local governments section for $350 billion. But this pie chart, which is hard to read on purpose because the $1.9 trillion legislation was so extensive and it covered many, many areas of relief related to COVID and financial recovery. Next slide, please. So of the $350 billion for state and local governments, 130 billion of it is coming to counties and cities. There's a 50-50 split, and after a calculation was conducted by the U.S. Treasury, the city of Santa Barbara is slated to receive approximately $21.8 million. The first tranche of the ARPA funds, coming in at $10.9 million, was received back in May of 2021. And the second tranche, which is before you today for your consideration, is scheduled to be received in May of 2022, so in just a few months. Next slide, please. The United States Treasury has come out with a great deal of guidance and requirements for the uses and appropriation of those funds. This slide here summarizes all of the eligible uses at the highest categorization as to how those funds can be used. It includes funds allocated for public health, addressing the negative economic impacts related to COVID, providing funds for services to disproportionately impacted communities, premium pay for employees and essential workers, infrastructure, and revenue replacement. The first tranche of the ARPA funds was used towards revenue replacement, and the second tranche that is before you today crosses multiple programs that are listed on this slide here. Next slide, please. So before going into the second tranche, I wanted to make sure that everyone is clear as to the action that council took for the first tranche. Back in June of 2021, as part of the fiscal year 22 budget process, the city council unanimously voted to approve of the entire first tranche of $10.9 million to be appropriated in the general fund to partially offset the revenue that was lost since COVID began. The initial estimates of revenue loss in the general fund are approximately $20 million. It will be more than that though, once it comes time for us to prepare our next report to the US Treasury. Downtown parking and other funds were also substantially impacted for revenue loss. In total, citywide, we were projecting that we have lost more than $30 million. You can see our revenue loss in Santa Barbara is more than the ARPA funds actually replace. And that's unique to us. Many other cities did not experience the depth of revenue loss that we experienced. During 2021, as I mentioned in the prior presentation, the contingency reserves were fully depleted, and we were already dipping into our disaster reserves to continue to sustain our existing operations. Allowing the $10.9 million to be used for revenue loss allowed us to continue to provide services to the public and not have to deteriorate our services any further than they already were. So that was the action that council took back in June. Next slide, please. So in preparation for receiving the second tranche of ARPA funds, it's scheduled to be received in just a couple months here, staff went through a very extensive evaluation process to determine how those funds should be spent based on need. We prioritized those requests in these two major buckets. The first priority being continued revenue loss. As I mentioned earlier, there continues to be revenue loss broadly across the city, primarily in the general fund and downtown parking. There's also a focus on continuing to provide a similar level of services. So we've incurred additional expenditures. We want to make sure that we can continue to provide services to residents and visitors. That was priority number one. Priority number two was funds to help us offset any additional costs that we might incur related to COVID. That includes additional wear and tear on city facilities and infrastructure, and then also address changes to our workforce. There has been a number of changes to our workforce over the past couple of years, which we'll go into with some of the requests. Next slide, please. So this slide and the subsequent slides outline staff's recommendations for how we are proposing to allocate the $10.9 million second tranche of ARPA funds. And I'll go through these very briefly. First, employee COVID testing. We implemented an employee COVID testing program a few months ago. We're seeking appropriation for $400,000, but we've actually only spent about $150,000 of expenditures on this. So we do not need this full request. And the likelihood of needing additional testing services is winding down. So there's a little bit more money there that you have an option to use for something else. The next three items are related to infrastructure and fixture and facilities in the Recreation and Parks Department, related to renovation and repair work for Plaza Del Mar bandshell, turf and irrigation renewals, and the Oak Park dance floor. These facilities incurred additional wear and tear during COVID, and they require repair work in order to continue to operate safely for the public. Next slide, please. The Acela system is a software application that's used by our community development department primarily and other departments. That software system has some more additional robust functionality that staff would like to utilize to be able to provide a better, seamless, better experience for customers and developers and those that require interaction with community development. So there's some system improvements being proposed there. The next item is a classification and compensation study for $450,000. This project is being proposed to address changes to the city's operations and staffing that has occurred over the past 2 years, develop strategies for retaining qualified employees, strategies for maintaining a competitive place in the market to attract, and also ensure that our staffing structures are sufficient in order to respond to evolving needs of the community. The next item for homeless and mental health services would fund a co-response officer for up to 3 years. The next item for library digital materials. People are interacting with the library in different ways during COVID. And with the change recently with the Black Gold Cooperative, there's a need to procure additional digital materials for the library for the public to consume. The last item on this slide here is a garage for a library mobile customer service delivery vehicle. We already have the vehicle in place. It is very successful and the public is utilizing it, but we are in need of a garage to be able to store this vehicle. It's a one-time use, which is appropriate with this ARPA money, which is one time as well. Next slide, please. The first item here for broadband strategic plan. This was an action that the City Council took back on November 16th of 2021 to allocate this tranche of ARPA money to a regional broadband strategic planning effort with the county of just about $60,000. So this action was already taken by the City Council. The next item is to replenish lost revenue in the general fund. So similar to the action that council took for the first tranche, there still will be additional revenue loss and has been additional revenue loss in the general fund. The current fiscal year projection, though, is that there will be a small amount of surplus that the general fund will experience. And so this amount, although it may not be necessary for the current fiscal year, there are additional deficits being projected in the next 3 fiscal years. So this amount of money could be used to replace some revenue loss in the general fund. The next item is in regards to revenue loss in the downtown parking fund. We mentioned earlier and have been talking about with the Finance Committee that the downtown parking fund experienced a great deal of revenue loss, and their reserves have decreased substantially over the past 4 years as well. I know that the downtown parking staff are looking at options to consider for the upcoming budget cycle, but the fund is already below policy targets and is close to being actually dipping in even further to have depleted their reserves in the coming year, barring anything else different. So this revenue loss, money being allocated for this would be very useful for the downtown parking fund. The last item on this one is also a revenue loss for the downtown parking fund, but this one is specific for a transitional housing project that is being proposed in coordination with the county for homeless and housing services. There are a number of parking spaces that will not be able to be used for commercial use. And so this item would replace the revenue that would normally be generated from parking activities in those spots. So this amount represents 3 years of lost revenue just from those spots not being used for normal commercial activities. So in summary, the items that I just went through are staff's recommendations for the ARPA second tranche. It totals around $9.3 million. Next slide, please. So staff had a number of other options that we considered, and the next 2 slides summarize a number of the other options that are for your consideration. So we've categorized them as additional options for the Finance Committee to consider. First is homeless and mental health services. This would be similar to the request that we mentioned earlier. It would be an additional co-response officer for up to 1 year. COVID cleaning protocols. The city has incurred expense of around $110,000 since COVID began to perform cleaning services in city facilities. We anticipate that it'll be around $150,000 in total through COVID. So this would offset the additional expenditures directly related to cleaning services for COVID. The next item is for the rent control program. Earlier in February, the City Council took an action to authorize staff to develop a scope of work for a potential rent control program. And that action that you took back in February appropriated $200,000 of general fund reserves. This item right here would replace the use of general fund reserves with ARPA funding for that rent control program initiative. Next is pandemic pay for $1.5 million. Similar to many other cities and municipalities across the state and across the country, this item here acknowledges the great deal of hard work that the essential workers have performed since COVID began. And this amount in total represents a one-time payout to current employees that continue to act as essential workers and perform services to make sure that our public and our community is safe. Next slide, actually not before next slide. The last item on this table here is the Clean Energy Program. So as you may be aware, the general fund has loaned $2 million to the Clean Energy Enterprise Fund as startup funding as that enterprise matures and develops. The request here would be to effectively forgive the first annual payment from the general fund for this program as it continues to mature. Next slide, please. The first item here is for the State Street deep cleaning and lighting enhancement. State Street has had a significant amount of additional use during COVID, and this amount represents a quarterly deep cleaning of 10 blocks on the main promenade, which would cost about $100,000 for each cleaning and would span over 3 years. So that's what this request entails. The next item for State Street master planning would be additional costs that staff anticipates needing to be included for the full scope of the planning effort for the State Street master plan. This next item here would be an additional request for the library for additional digital materials. As we mentioned earlier, it's an additional request to the one made earlier. And then finally, this last item here would be revenue replacement for the general fund. And as I mentioned earlier, the general fund is anticipated to have additional revenue loss over the next 3 fiscal years. And so this item right here would address future revenue loss related to COVID that is being projected as we continue to grapple with our structural deficit. Next slide, please. So staff's recommendation to the Finance Committee is that Finance Committee recommends to the City Council to accept the second ARPA payment of approximately $10.9 million that is scheduled to be remitted in May of 2022, appropriate $3,434,745 into the general fund and $1,188,789 into the downtown parking fund in fiscal year 22 to replace a portion of the revenue that was lost directly related to COVID, and then appropriate $6,295,228 to offset additional costs and address other impacts directly related to COVID-19 in fiscal year 22. With that, we'll take the committee's questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. DeMartini. So now we're going to open it up to questions from my colleagues. Let's see, Councilmember Harmon.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Just one quick one for now about the garage for the library mobile delivery vehicles. Where are they currently? Where is it or them? I'm not clear how many actually we have. So that's a second question. How many do we have? But where are they currently being stored? And is there a cost associated with that current storage and or a reason that it can't be continued to be stored there? Thank you.
I see Ms. Cariente, I believe you're on the line. If you could speak to that, please.
Thank you, Chair Friedman, Councilmember Harmon. The current library in the Go van is housed on Lower Plaza. And as you know, Library Plaza will be being renovated. And we have always had an aim to secure this van from theft. It is not just your typical bookmobile. It is a mobile library. The van itself costs upwards of $300,000. That was all donor and grant funded. We are getting a second electric vehicle as well. This vehicle was also a grant for $250,000. So we'll have two outreach vehicles to house our van. I'm sorry, a garage. Does that answer the questions?
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess just a follow up, I appreciate that. There's, would this be payment to an existing garage? Is it building a new garage? I guess I'm just not clear. Are we like building a brand new garage? And do we have a location for that? Is it city property?
Thank you,
okay.
Councilmember Harmon. Yes, so the East Side Library serves as our outreach hub for the City of Santa Barbara's public library services. So the plan is to create a master plan for that entire campus, including the library on the Go van. Garage will also be there.
Awesome.
So it is
thank you
property.
so much. Appreciate it. Thank
you. Don't go anywhere, Ms. Cariente. Since we're on there, that was one of the questions I had, and we do have these vans. And have we looked at other locations within the city to store, to park these vans?
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Prior to us acquiring our first van, we did a lot of research throughout the city. We looked at PD, Public Works yards, and essentially those departments don't have enough space to park all of their fleet vehicles. And so the library needed to find its own space to park the van. The van is also too large to fit in any of our city parking garages. And so we are limited to where it can be parked as well.
Thank you. I'll save my question. I see Councilmember Gutierrez. You have your camera on?
I just wanted to thank staff for this report. I don't have any questions at this moment. Thank you.
Okay, great. I do have a couple of more questions. So on slide 12, it's the clean energy loan forgiveness. Would it be possible, rather than trying to forgive the loan out of these funds, if we could just simply defer repayment of that loan till a later time, till the program is up and running, and then once it has the proper reserves, repay it at a later time?
Chair Friedman, yes, thank you for that question. Yes, that's definitely an option for the Finance Committee and the City Council to consider. And perhaps that's an action that could be considered during the upcoming fiscal year 23 budget process to provide that direction to staff to delay the loan payment if that's the choice that you like to make. Yes.
Thank you. And then my follow-up question on the State Street deep cleaning and lighting enhancement. That is for 3 years, but it's my understanding is, would businesses, if we weren't going to cover this, would businesses pay that, or who pays for that if we didn't have this, this funding available?
Chair Friedman and council members, right now it's, yes, set up for the downtown parking budget to accommodate, but that is something that we could look into for charging a cost to businesses.
So right now it's the downtown parking fund, which is having its own challenges. So it would either be at some point it could be a general fund subsidy, or we would charge the businesses. But in this case, if we were to allocate it, we could get 3 years out of this program and find a way to fund it in the future.
Correct.
Chair Friedman and Finance Committee, I just want to add, the other option is just not to do the additional cleaning. I think in your budget update, you heard a very clear indication of the status of both the general fund and the downtown parking funds. So this is not a mandatory program. We feel like it's a nice augment to the, really it's a way to support local business on State Street.
Yeah. We could have everyone mute themselves, please. Thank you. And then the last question I have, Ms. Bjork, if you could come back on for 1 second. It's the State Street Master Plan. It's for 300 that we need to do this, but is that Measure C eligible, or is this something that we would prefer to take out of here?
We can certainly, that would be Measure C eligible, yes.
Okay, thank you. Just trying to get us to 10.9 million here. So with that, since there are no other questions, I will now open it up to public comment, and I will put it at 2 minutes since we are pressed for time with the council meeting starting at 2. So if you are a member of the public and wish to speak to this item, please raise your hand in the app. And I see Ian Bakke, followed by Summers Case, and then Zach Smith. There'll be a couple more. So Mr. Bakke.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Chair Friedman, council members. I appreciate it. I'm very interested in this discussion, particularly because I just finished a 6-month fellowship with the National Association of Counties, where I was pretty much 100% focused on the state and local fiscal recovery fund. And thankfully, the rules for cities and counties are the same. And as some of you might know, the Treasury Department's final rule they put out on January 6th pretty much gives the city and local governments really broad flexibility over $10 million of their allocation, the total allocation, for any government service traditionally provided. I like a lot of what's been suggested in the staff report, but there's one thing I would really like to suggest. A really important service that's not included is investing in our transportation infrastructure, specifically pedestrian and cyclist access and safety projects. As a member of the Transportation Circulation Committee, I know how many really transformative investments we can make here. Staff, the public, the pedestrian and bicycle master plans have all identified a lot of really great projects that would offer very significant returns on investment, I believe, for our city, making it easier to live, visit, commute, and shop here. I would respectfully request not to mess with your calculation, that you explore and recommend to the full city council an allocation of $1 million for high priority pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure projects. There's so many that can really improve people's lives in this city, and we might not get another chance to use money like this for a project like this. We shouldn't be entirely reliant on grant programs, in my opinion, to be investing in this, what is the city's responsibility to make it easier to be mobile and get around. There's so many examples I could cite about pedestrian overcrossing, just bike lanes that don't cost that much, protected bike lanes. I think it'd be very much worth the investment. So I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Bakke. And then I am going to give 5 more minutes for anybody who wants to raise their hand and wishes to speak. So at 1:29, we'll cut it off for additional public comment. And I will read off who is on the list right now. I have Summers Case, Zach Smith, Margaret Caraco, Barbara Cronin Hirschberg. And so now Summers Case, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. I yield my time to Zach Smith.
Typically we don't yield time, but I will allow it. I will allow it this time since there's 2, just in order of efficiency. I think it would take longer to try to figure out how to do that. So we'll go.
Thank you.
For Zach Smith, you get 4 minutes.
Hello, members of the Finance Committee. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
My name is Zach Smith. I'm the city's General Unit Chapter Chair and IT employee. The following statement was prepared by the elected leadership and bargaining team representing our chapter. We want to start with gratitude. City workers are heroes. Without us, plans are delayed, trash piles up, and there is no one to call when a sewer line breaks. Without us, environmental, economic, health, and safety priorities cannot be carried out. During the pandemic, like in the mudslides or the recession or any crisis we've been through, more is expected of us. We are all juggling between several jobs, filling in for positions that have been unfilled for years or sometimes decades, while the work is either left on the books or contracted out to more expensive groups that we spend our time managing. And while we've done all this admirably, we are all struggling to keep up with an ever-increasing workload and less people to carry it out. Staff turnover has also been a severe issue at the city, where we are losing diligent and respected coworkers to neighboring agencies like the county, Goleta, or Santa Maria, which recently gave nearly 10 times the amount considered here in Hero Pay to their employees as part of their contract bargaining process. Morale is low here, and our contract bargaining process, which we are currently going through, is not helping. Our wages have not kept up with either comparable agencies or inflation for decades, and things are getting worse. Like in years past, financial information is being presented to us with the goal of keeping our wages as low as possible. But the presentation doesn't meet reality, where we've seen our investment account grow by nearly $100 million during the pandemic. Transient occupancy tax is up 30% over pre-pandemic 2019 for the fiscal year, and monies gained from COVID-related grants like the one discussed today outnumber unspecific projections of revenue lost due to COVID. We hear structural deficit repeated in the media, but if you can't afford to pay workers enough to provide an adequate level of service to the public, then there is an accounting issue that needs your undivided attention as a committee. Our families saw a $3,500 increase in their health insurance costs this year. Meanwhile, the city is offering $23,500 a year in cash out bonuses to managers if they decline to join our group plan, which drives up costs for the rest of us that need the plan to survive. In bargaining, we're often put with an awful choice of whether to allocate money towards our health or something else, like bilingual pay, which is well below market here, or a wage increase or a position inequity that has been ignored for decades. The amount you are offering to our bargaining groups for these decisions is meager, and we are struggling to live in or near the city we serve as is. We are at a crisis point, not just as a group of employees or an organization, but as a community. Our workers cannot keep up with the cost of working here, which makes city services suffer. We need to sound the alarm about that and treat it as a first priority organizational crisis. Again, we are grateful for the opportunity to speak on this item today. Allocating money to city workers through Hero Pay is a wise investment in our community. We need this and are supportive of the recommendation to grant Hero Pay. However, at a time when we're trying to fend off wage cuts against inflation, it is critical that this committee and council as a whole recognize that the Hero Pay allocated here is a Band-Aid on an open wound. The only true way to adequately compensate employees, avoid pay cuts, and increase equity is through a meaningful and fair contract. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Next, we have Margaret Caraco.
Thank you, Chair Friedman and members of the Finance Committee. This is Margaret Caraco, and I'm a member of the Santa Barbara Library Advisory Board. I'd like to support the request of library staff for funding from ARPA for a garage for their van and for purchase of digital materials. As you know, the library is a central institution of our community, providing access to much more than reading materials. In myriad ways, the library staff serve diverse groups across the city, young and old, English and Spanish speakers. And if citizens cannot make it to the library, the van takes reading materials and services to neighborhoods across the city. Access to digital materials is an increasingly important element within the array of services the library offers, and the problems associated with the provision of digital materials has recently been documented in the national press and can be seen in proposed legislation in states across the country. The price of these digital materials continues to go up, and additional funding is needed to address the rising demand. In conclusion, I respectfully request that the Finance Committee and City Council agree to support the budget requests of the Santa Barbara Public Library. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Caraco. So I will close new members to the public for comments. So the final remaining speaker will be Barbara Cronin Hirschberg. Need to unmute yourself, Ms. Hirschberg. There you go.
Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Cronin Hirschberg, and I currently have the pleasure of serving on the Santa Barbara Library Board, in addition to being president of the Santa Barbara Friends of the Library. If you follow the library on social media and through their weekly digital newsletter, you will not need to be convinced that the library is doing phenomenal work despite the budget cuts they've endured. I'm excited that there is potential money for library use from the American Rescue Plan Act. I agree with the staff recommended request for library digital materials and for a library garage for our van on the go. The library has already secured grant funding for an additional outreach van based on the success of the first one and the needs in the community. They have been able to travel to various neighborhoods that don't have a library, to senior centers, to parks, to low-income housing. Needless to say, the vans will need a secure garage to safely store materials and to protect the vehicles from theft, weather, vandalism, etc. They also need access to power to charge the vehicles and outreach devices. There has been a huge rise in the demand for digital materials from the library. Although this is partly because the early months of the pandemic, library access was not possible, but the trend continues. Many people are physically unable to visit the library, so they have access to books, research material, newspapers, movies, etc. digitally. The Student Success Card initiative provides over 10,000 Santa Barbara Unified students access to digital content. Thank you for your support of this outstanding community center.
Thank you, Ms. Hirschberg. So now we are back to the Finance Committee. And so what I'm going to do is, like we said earlier, we'll go through, and each of us will go through on which items that we support having a conversation about moving forward. So we'll go through the list, and if each of my colleagues can just go and name the ones that you support. And keep in mind that don't take into account the full cost right now, as if you want to have that conversation. And some of these we might even be able to fund at a reduced amount if you want to have that conversation. So just to show, I'll start it off and I'll go through each one. So based on the comments of Mr. DiMartini and staff presentation, I'll start off on slide 9 here. So I'm going to support the Plaza Del Mar band, the turf irrigation, the Oak Park dance floor. And again, I want to thank all the members of the public who spoke today and our staff. And I think there's a key point is a lot of our infrastructure is being used more heavily during COVID. So that these are some of the most important aspects of our community here that we've been using.
Chair Friedman, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm so sorry. If you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to be tracking these council committee comments as we go through. Is that okay with you, Chair Friedman?
Perfect. Yep.
Thank you. Okay. I apologize for interrupting. Please proceed.
Okay. So I said the Plaza Del Mar, the turf irrigation renewal, the Oak Park dance floor, the Acela, the classification and compensation study. I do want to speak to this real briefly in that in the staff report, it says these are typically done every 5 to 7 years, and we haven't done one in a few decades is what it said in the staff report. So I think it is time, and it also will help us address some of these inequities that our staff have been mentioning. Homeless and mental health services, library digital materials. I'm going to put in the library garage, but this is one I think we might be able to do reduced funding and use Measure C funding later for it. The broadband, the replenished lost revenue of the general fund, I'm going to put that in, but this one, I'm not putting a dollar amount in. It's more of if we have a balancing at the end, I'd like it to go there, but it's more if we can get there. Replenished lost fund in downtown parking and the downtown parking conditional housing project, supportive of those two. And then the second additional options, like to, if we can, do the homeless and mental health services, COVID cleaning protocols, support pandemic pay. I think our staff has been really doing such a tremendous job. And again, a lot of these facilities that have the upkeep, our staff is there to make sure they were open during this time. And then on the clean energy loan forgiveness, I'm gonna ask if we can, at the end, make a recommendation to council to not put it in part of here, but just have it deferred to a later time until that fund is up and running. So that would be also a recommendation I'd like to make today, but not funding it. And then State Street deep cleaning. And then the master plan, I'm gonna put it in there, but I could also make the case that we should fund that from Measure C. So it just matters if we could get there or not within the 10.9 million. The additional digital materials, again, we have that earlier, if we can get there on this one, but I like to put it in there. And then the other thing I wanna add, I think we'd have too much if we did the revenue or replenish the lost revenue in future years. But there is another item I'd like to add for consideration from my colleagues, and that is to fund the opening of the libraries fully to the full 7 days a week. It costs about $650,000. That's the budget estimate I've received from the library director and our city administrator. And the reason it's essential now is that if we are going to open them as part of the budget process later, it would, as I understand it, be coming out of the general fund reserves. But if we were to signal now that we opened it now, there's some strategic reasons for that. In particular, it helps the schools, in particular Adelante Charter School, which uses the East Side Library as their school library. And it's actually closed to the school 3 days a week. So it helps them in their planning process for their budgets next year rather than having to wait till June. And there's some other reasons, but in the interest of time, I'm going to put that out there for consideration. And I see that Councilmember Gutierrez, you have your camera on. So if you want to go through and see what you support, and then we'll see where we get after Councilmember Harmon.
Okay. The Plaza Del Mar, the major turf and irrigation renewal of the Oak Park dance floor, the recommendations for Excella systems, classified and compensation studies, the homeless and mental health services, the digital materials, and the garage for the mobile. The broadband strategic plan, the replenish lost revenue in the downtown parking lot, parking fee revenue, and then the transition house project on that one. For the additional options, the homeless and mental health service, the COVID cleaning protocols, rent control program, and the pandemic pay. And the State Street deep cleaning, digital materials for the library, and the recommendation that my colleague just suggested. And that's all. Thank you.
Councilmember Harmon.
Thank you. Pretty similar. I'll start with Plaza Del Mar, the turf and irrigation, Oak Park dance floor, Acela improvements, the classification study, homeless and mental health services, digital materials. I do want to make the caveat though that sorry, baby's about to start crying, that I strongly support the recommendation to open the library 7 days a week. So if we're sort of ordering things at some point, that would be my top priority. So I'm saying yes to all of these requests. I support them all, but really strongly request the suggestion by Chair Friedman, and that would be my sort of number one in the grand scheme of library recommendations. So just putting that out there. And then similarly on the garage, I'll I'll say yes to that, but I love the suggestion. I think it was Chair Friedman you made to consider using Measure C monies for that. So that could be an interesting approach, but we'll say yes for now. Broadband, yes. I will also say yes to replenishing lost revenue in the general fund. I agree with Chair Friedman on this as well about maybe taking a balancing approach at the end, reducing this number so that we can get some of these other things in. So we're on the same page there, Chair Friedman. Yes to the downtown, both downtown parking fund items. Thank you, Mr. DeMartini. And then let's see, okay. Yes to the additional homeless and mental health services. The COVID cleaning protocols, I guess it's necessary, so yes. Rent control, yes. What's the next one? Sorry, what's the economic development initiatives? Sorry.
Yeah, economic development.
What is that? That's not on my.
Mr. DeMartini?
Yes. Committee Member Harmon, that I apologize for that. I believe that is a prior item that did not make it to the agenda report, so I apologize for that. Or sorry, Director Isaacson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Martini, Chair Friedman, Councilmember Harmon. This is a $50,000 amount that would be used towards continuing to work with a economic development group that we're currently working with that was previously funded through outside agency requests that we no longer can fund with using that process. So this would be a way to replace that funding.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to skip that one. Thank you. Yes to the pandemic pay, and I would like to increase that amount if possible. Just throwing that out there. I know we're supposed to be doing the opposite, but I'm interested in increasing that. Agree with the deferral of clean energy. So that's a good idea there. State Street Deep Clean, yes. Master planning, yes, let's increase it. Master planning, yes. Digital materials, yes, with the same caveat as above. And I will also skip the replenishing lost revenue. And great, I think that gets us through. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Harmon. So Mr. DeMartini, if you could, let's total everything up, but I'm specifically interested in the total that we have without the general fund replacement, because that was 3.4 million, and the library garage, and see where we're at without those two items.
Sure, Chair Friedman. So I will delete the $3.4 million request for the general fund right here. And then this column includes the $650,000 request for the opening the libraries to 7 days a week. And so the total of all of those items equals $13.9 million. So we're about $3 million over. But Chair Friedman, there were a few items on this list that none of the committee members expressed interest for. So should I go ahead and remove those items as well? For example,
I'm sorry, I didn't make that clear. Anything that didn't get 2 votes, let's.
So this item didn't get any votes, so I deleted that. This item right here for the economic development initiatives didn't get any votes either. I'll delete that. And then $3 million for replenishing lost revenue, I deleted that. So that total, just going to check my math here, is about $10.4 million, which means you have about $450,000 to allocate.
Okay, so we have 3 items. One was funding towards the garage, some at least seed funding. The other was some general fund replacement. And then the other was Councilmember Harmon suggested increasing the pandemic pay. And so, Ms. Bjork, if you could come on for a moment, I want to understand I really want to understand, because I see the value in increasing our employees as well, but I want to understand that garage issue on whether it's Measure C eligible, but is there a planning portion of it yet? Do we have the location confirmed. I'm just trying to understand where we are in that process before we allocate any dollars to it, or if it's something that perhaps we can wait through it goes to that master planning process and use Measure C later.
Excuse me, Chair Friedman, we have not begun any work on that project at all. So yes, it would be appropriate to at least begin doing the preliminary and understand where we are. And then I'm sorry, because I'm on, I just want to make sure that Mr. DeMartini included the 650 in his spreadsheet calculation. Did you manage to get a chance to add, make sure that was included in?
Yes, we did.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So
it is in there, yes. Thank you.
So with that information, we're about 500, a little less than 500,000, 450.
Chair Friedman, if I may, I believe that the committee also directed that the $500,000 for the clean energy program, it seems like the consensus is to defer. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this as an ARPA request as well.
Perfect.
So that gives about $950,000 to allocate.
Okay, so Councilmember Harmon, you made the request for increasing pandemic pay, being that we have some left over here. We have the general fund, we have that, and then the garage seem to be the outstanding three. So do you have a suggestion here?
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Yeah, I want to make a pitch for committing some portion of this. I mean, it looks like we're at almost $1 million. I'd like to see at least half of that go to increasing the pandemic pay. Our employees have been on the front lines for the last 2 years. And really have kept the city running. I mean, so much of what we've accomplished over the last 2 years is directly related to their willingness to continue to show up day after day, despite significant risk to themselves. And I think the comments that were made at public comment were really important and very moving to me and really highlighted just how difficult it's been for our employees for the last 2 years. And so to me, this is would be a great use of money. So I will make the pitch to put 500,000 additionally into pandemic pay. And then I will support my colleagues on how they would like to allocate the remaining, looks like 450,000 approximately. So I'll leave that to you, Chair Friedman.
Okay, Councilmember Gutierrez, do you have comments on the increase in pandemic pay and then on the other two items?
I support the increase on the pandemic pay. And what are the other two items?
So the other two would be to start the process to plan for the secure garage for, it's not just one, but 2 vehicles for the library, vans on the go. And then the other would be any leftovers, put that into the general fund to replenish lost revenue.
I'm good with moving forward to finding a location for the vans. Also, Mr. DeMartini, how much would that leave us over? Left over, sorry.
Committee Member Gutierrez, if I make what change? What are you asking if we?
With the increase, with moving forward with the garage for the libraries, for their vans.
Sure, the garage is already included. So
Okay.
we have the $1 million for the garage for the library here. It's already here.
Okay.
Oh, that's part of it. I thought we had taken that out. Just
Yeah, I thought you did too.
For Measure C,
I took out the general fund revenue loss items, both of them, is I believe the direction from the committee. But if I mistook you, please tell me.
We had said that if we can get part of that money through Measure C.
So how about, that's a good guy. For some reason, I thought we had reduced that $1 million and we're going to work our way back up. So right now, what if we put $500,000 for the garage so we could get the process going, and then the other, and then what's left over if we did that, and then increase the pandemic pay? I'm supportive of that. I think our employees have made the case. So put that up to $2 million. And then that leaves us with
950,000, because we had about 950,000 that you were trying to allocate. If you reduce the garage down by 500,000 and increase the pandemic pay by 500,000, that's a wash.
And if we put that into the general fund replace lost revenue, that could help us next year in case there are any impacts. And we can also have more of a discussion at the full council on other priority items as well, because we'll have that additional funding if other things come up between now and budget hearings. Is that fair to say? Great. Councilmember Gutierrez and then Councilmember Harmon.
Chair Friedman, I have a quick question. For the economic outside contractor that the Community Development Department was working with, they were requesting 50,000?
Correct.
Trying to look at the screen. Is there any way that I wouldn't mind giving them the 50,000? I don't know how everybody else feels in the committee.
It's only 50,000 and we have this, and we've been working with them. And if we could get a report to the full council, Mr. Isaacson, we could make the recommendation today contingent on a full report on what we have achieved with the previous expenditures.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
I'll be supportive of that. Councilmember Harmon.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. And I think a report when it comes to full council would be great, but I agree with, excuse me, something's beeping. Okay, I agree with that. I wanted to see if there would be any interest from my colleagues in further increasing the pandemic pay now that we have this additional monies up to 750,000. So we added 5, so adding another 250, so 2.25. And the reason that I'm pushing this is just, again, what I said. I mean, our employees, clearly there are morale issues right now, and some of that is directly related to the work that we have tasked them with through the pandemic, and they've just really been there for us. And so with this extra money that we're finding, I want to make a second pitch to add another, I guess it would be 250,000 to this number, and see if there'd be interest from my colleagues, and really just showing as a city how much we believe in our employees and how much we value them. So I'm throwing that out there to see if you guys might be amenable.
Councilmember Gutierrez.
Mr. DeMartini, can you show me the number that would go back to our reserves, or, you know, whatever's left over if we do that increase?
I think we also need to put the 50,000 in for the economic development right above where you just were.
Okay, so if I add $50,000 for economic development, I increase the pandemic pay to $2.25 million. You have just over $650,000 left to allocate.
I'm good with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm good with that now that I see it's 650. And what I'd like to do is, Ms. Bjork, if you could come on for just a moment. For the library garage, you said we still have to do the planning and the location. Could we use, say, 250,000? Because I assume there's a cost with that planning process to start that up. Could we use that and then put the remainder into the general fund?
Chair Friedman, absolutely. I mean, quite honestly, the number that we have here is absolutely just a guess because we haven't done any of the work on that. So 250 would go a long way to getting us started and doing plans and specifications and understanding the true cost. And typically when we do a big project like this, we would budget our design costs first. And then once we have the design done, we would budget the construction costs. So we can certainly, I think 250 would probably do very well for us in getting us through a substantial portion of design.
I'll make the recommendation that we do 250 there. If you could put that in, Mr. DeMartini, and then we'll see what the remainder of the balance is. And the remainder of the balance is?
Increased to just over $900,000.
And then the rest would go into the general fund.
For revenue replacement?
Yes.
Okay.
Whatever that number is to get us right to 10.9 million.
If I do not just over $900,000, that gets us fully allocated.
Okay. So we have everything here. I think we've had a good discussion. Councilmember Gutierrez, before we get to a motion.
A thought came to my mind right now. For this State Street Committee, I know that they were asking for money because this planning process is going to take a while. Ms. Bjork, where is that money coming from?
So far, the State Street Committee work has been funded out of Measure C.
And will it continue coming out of that Measure
That's
C?
what staff has anticipated thus far, yes.
Okay, so if they would ask for more money, there is sufficient money for Measure C to continue supporting that group?
There's finite money in Measure C, but we will adjust other priorities to continue that priority.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so we have a 10.9 million balanced based on the recommendations. And so if I could get a motion for this plus a recommendation to council to defer the community choice Santa Barbara Clean Energy loan to a later date and bring back a report to the Economic Development Initiative to the council as part of budget discussions. And I believe that is everything. Am I missing anything on what a motion would be, Mr. DiMartini?
Chair Friedman, I believe that would cover the full motion that's required. Thank you.
And may I get that motion?
Yeah, I can make the motion.
Motion's been made by Committee Member Gutierrez. Is there a
I'll
second?
second. I'll second.
Second. Any further discussion? Not hearing any, can we take a roll call, please?
Yes, the motion was made by Committee Member Gutierrez, seconded by Committee Member Harmon. We'll start with Committee Member Gutierrez.
Yes.
Committee Member Harmon.
Yes.
Committee Chair Friedman.
Yes.
That motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks. Good work, everyone. We have a council meeting in 4 minutes, so we'll see you in just a couple minutes. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.